Hello and welcome to my new video. Today I'm going to show you how to sew this incredibly romantic cotton midi skirt. I didn't make a mock-up for the skirt as it was a simpler piece to make than dress or trousers. I only measured and checked the waistband measurements and the skirt length. As usual, I pre-washed the fabric and then pressed it. This skirt goes without lining in the original pattern, but the fabric that I had bought online during the lockdown was a little bit thinner and more transparent than I'd expected. So I decided to go for the lining. Both fabrics were 100% cotton. I pinned and chalked 2 front and 1 back skirt piece as the seam allowances were not included in the pattern. Mine were 3 cm for the bottom edge and 1 cm for the rest seams. Don't forget to put all the markings, then cut. I also cut the waistband. It was 81 cm long and 13 cm wide. Then I cut 4 pocket pieces. For the lining, I cut the same front and back skirt pieces, but shortened all of them in height by 2 cm and the front parts in width by 5 cm to exclude the button stands. Don't forget to add the seam allowances. Mine were 1 cm for each edge. We should line each button stand with the fusible interfacing, excluding the waistline seam allowances, as we don't want to have a lot of bulk there. After fusing the interfacing, I tucked in the bottom 3 cm seam allowance to the wrong side and pressed. I used a 6 cm chalk line I'd made earlier to help me. To strengthen the pocket openings, I've used the interfacing lengthwise thread tape starting 1 cm upper and ending 1 cm lower the pocket opening marks, and then fused the tape to all 4 pocket pieces to the edges that would be connected with the skirt. Then I pinned all 4 pocket parts to the skirt using the marks and stitched with a 7 mm seam allowance, so that these seams won't be seen later. I pressed the seams flat and ironed the seam allowances out to the pockets. Then top stitched the pocket front side by 1 mm off the edge, thus attaching the seam allowance to the pocket. I did it only for the front skirt part pocket pieces. Then I pinned the front and back skirt parts together. I highly recommend pinning the pocket openings together. This will prevent shifting of the layers. I stitched with 1 cm seam allowance, first from the waistline to the pocket marking, then on the pocket and under the pocket. I double stitched at the pocket openings to strengthen these places. Guess what's next? Yes, pressing. As usual, I pressed the seams flat and then turned the seam allowances with pockets to the front skirt and pressed. But I pressed seams open under the pockets and did the same steps for the other side. After that, I pinned and stitched together the front and the back skirt parts of the lining at their sides with 1 cm seam allowance. Then pressed the seams flat and open using a special homemade pad. Then I pinned the button stands and the lining from the waistline to the bottom. But our lining was shorter, so I marked 1 cm off the pressed edge. That would be where the lining ends, and 1 cm again, that would be the end of the seam, and stitched with 1 cm seam allowance. I also pressed the seams flat and then pressed the seam allowances to the lining, and then pressed the front parts using the chalk lines. My next step was connecting the front and the lining bottom edges. That could be a little bit confusing as our lining was shorter. I marked the end of the button stand, that is the place where the lining should also end. Then tucked the lining seam allowance to the lining and stitched with 1 cm seam allowance. Please follow the video and you'll make it. I liked the result but still had to finish the button stand bottom edge. I stitched connecting 2 points like it was shown in the video. Then trimmed the excess material and turned the thin out, set in the corner right, repeated these steps for the other side and pressed, tucking the seam allowances to the lining. And the time had come for the pleats and gathers. I gathered the waistline of the front into pleats using marks. Then secured them with 7 mm seam allowance, stitching with a large stitch stroke as this seam would also help us to make a gather later. I stitched 3 separate seams, one for the left front piece, one for the back and one for the right piece, so it would be easier to make gathers. I didn't stitch on the upper pocket edges. The gather in my case was as follows: right front piece 7 cm without gather and 13.5 cm of gather, plus back piece 38 cm of gather, plus left front piece 13.5 cm of gather, plus 7 cm without gather. After that, I made a lot of folds at the lining waistline. I preferred the folds to the gathers as I wanted less bulk at the waist seam, but you could make another gather if you like. Let's prepare our waistband. I folded it in half and pressed. Then bend the seam allowance of only one side by 1 cm to the wrong side, using the 2 cm wide chalk line for convenience. And marked a 1 cm seam allowance in the corners as I decided to line the waistband. I'll use these marks later when fusing the interface into the waistband, as I didn't want it to get into the seams and make them bulkier. So the interfacing piece should be 79 by 11 cm. I used a very thick material, usually used for collars and sleeve cuffs. When ready, I attached 2 skirt layers to the waistband, excluding 1 cm seam allowance of the last from its both ends as it is shown in the video. I stitched with a 1 cm seam allowance. Then I trimmed the excess threads and pressed the seam flat, gently not touching together, and ironed the seam allowances out to the waistband. My next step was pinning and stitching the waistband's shorter sides together, right sides inside with 1 cm seam allowance. I trimmed the edge by half, turning the thin out, and set the corner right, then repeated the whole process for the other side. I decided to hand stitch the other waistband side to the skirt, closing up the seam allowances. I found it easier to pin the layers together first. Then came the buttons and buttonholes. There were 7, 2 of them at the waistband. I like to hide the threads inside to make their ends invisible. When sewing on a button, be sure you've left enough space between it and the fabric for a safe melt shank. When making a waistband, especially using natural materials such as cotton or linen, one usually shrinks a waistband's upper edge a little bit with an iron and stretches the bottom edge. But I wanted my waistband to be steady, thus I lined it with a thick fusible interfacing, so it was impossible to do these steps with the edges. When I finished the skirt and tried it on, I didn't like its fitting at the waistband's upper edge and decided to make 2 darts. The darts' total maximum width was 1 cm each, so the skirt upper edge length became shorter by 2 cm. I hope you enjoyed sewing with me and thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to leave a comment below, I'll be very glad if you just say hi. See you in the next video, bye!